Welcome everybody to the Cato Institute. I'm Ian Vasquez, Vice President for International Studies here. We are accustomed to thinking that the period when rich countries began to expressly help poor countries progress started in the post-World War II era of development economics, when organizations like the World Bank or national aid agencies were set up. But in his new book, Violent Saviors, the West's Conquest of the Rest, William Easterly reminds us that the West has sought to develop and frequently exploit the rest for hundreds of years, and it has regularly done so in the name of material progress. Whether it was the conquest of the Americas, the transatlantic slave trade, or colonialism in Asia or Africa, the West has used improvement in material well-being, real or imagined, as an important rationale for its international projects. Of course, material progress is a laudable goal, but is it the most important element of progress? Bill Easterly asks, what about what the people who are supposedly being helped want? What about consent? What about choice? And what about treating people with dignity as adults capable of making their own decisions about how to improve their lives? Things have much improved, of course, since the bad old days of conquest and slave trade. We have freer markets and free trade all around the world. But even today, ways in which the developed West tries to help developing countries too often prioritize material goods at the expense of choice and consent. In his effort to put autonomy, freedom, and choice back into the lexicon of international development, Bill also rescues a much neglected but rich classical liberal tradition going back to Adam Smith that favors persuasion and voluntary exchange instead of imperialism and coercion. I am delighted that Bill is joining us today to present his new book. I consider Bill one of the world's leading development economists and somebody whose insights has played a prominent role in the foreign aid and economic development debate in the past 25 years. Bill is Professor Emeritus of Economics at New York University and Co-Director Emeritus of the NYU Development Research Institute. The book that he will be discussing today is his fourth book. Previous to that, he published The Tyranny of Experts, Economists, Dictators, and the Forgotten Rights of the Poor in 2014, and The White Man's Burden, Why the West's Efforts to Aid the Rest Have Done So Much Ill and So Little Good, published in 2006. In the 80s and 90s, which is when I first met Bill was an important economist at the World Bank. It was there that he published his first book, which came out in 2001, The Elusive Quest for Growth, Economist Adventures and Misadventures in the Tropics, which, among other things, explained why foreign aid and so much of the work that the World Bank itself does has been ineffective. He promptly got fired for publishing that book, and we have all since then appreciated his independent scholarship, which he has continued to exhibit throughout all these years, and which certainly has given him a tremendous amount of credibility. Before I welcome him to give some remarks, I just will announce that we will be taking questions from both the online and in-person audience. The online audience may join the conversation and submit questions directly on the event webpage, Facebook, YouTube, and on X. Please help me welcome Bill Easterly. There you go.
Thank you, Ian. Really appreciate that. Ian didn't mention one other distinction that I'm really proud of. Among the entire set of development economists who have Parkinson's disease like I do, I'm in the top 2. I only know one other one. So it was kind of a complicated joke. That was the punchline. I expected my friend Ram to get that. The other one is a very good development economist, so he probably gets number one. Let me start with a little experiment with you guys, the audience. And the online guys can participate also. Let me tell you about an autocratic ruler who during 20 years in power achieved a growth rate for his poor country of 7% per year, way above average. This is in a region of Africa where growth rates have been low. So the question is, based on those facts alone, would you say this is a good ruler, bad ruler, somewhere in between? So how many would vote for a good ruler? Thank you. How many would vote for a bad ruler? How many would say somewhere in between? Okay. So that's kind of, how you were voting is kind of the same kind of ambiguity I felt during many years as a development economist at the World Bank and then at NYU as an economics professor. I was very inclined to sort of use GDP per capita growth or GDP per capita in general as a measure of well-being for the populations. By the way, the ruler that I had in mind was Meles Zenawi of Ethiopia, an autocratic ruler that was in power for 20 years until his death from natural causes in 2012. And along with achieving 7% growth, he also put hundreds of political dissidents in jail, forced farmers to resettle from their own villages into state-sponsored villages, manipulated food aid from donors for his own, to go to his own political supporters and to starve his political opponents. And I saw things like that, and I find it kind of maybe I need to rethink this, that he's a good ruler just because of 7% GDP growth. But it seemed like in development economics, we really sort of lacked a good way to kind of find a way to weight tyranny versus material progress, lack of freedom versus material progress. And so I thought maybe if I was going to kind of try to figure out these questions for myself, I needed a lot more help. Fortunately, a lot more help was available. An awful lot of help was available. Starting with a book that I stumbled across that I discovered, really great book called The Wealth of Nations by a fairly obscure Scottish economist named Adam Smith. And I started to realize that economists have been working on this issue for 250 years. So that's the sense in which there is a lot of help available. From Adam Smith to John Stuart Mill to P.T. Bauer to Milton Friedman to Amartya Sen to Ian Vasquez to Deirdre McCloskey. There is a very large liberal tradition in economics which has been discussing these issues for 250 years. And it turned out the context in which they were discussing these issues a lot was about during the West conquest of the West, during the process of Western colonialism, which did achieve material gains in many contexts. But liberal economists started questioning whether those material gains were really an improvement in well-being. So let me start even earlier, going back to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, going all the way back to a guy named John Winthrop, who was the first governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1629. He helped design this seal of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which had an Indian on the seal saying, there was this bubble coming out of his mouth saying, "Come over and help us." We don't really know who this Indian was. Maybe because he's entirely fictional. And he's shown as having a very peaceful, welcoming attitude. willing to put down the bow and arrow. And John Winthrop thought, wow, this is a great mission for our colony. And to any of the settlers or funders who sort of question whether this was such a helpful thing for the Indians, John Winthrop wrote a really persuasive prospectus in which he justified the taking of the land of the Native Americans. He said, after we take their land, and there is very much a we and them going on here, after we take their land, they will, quote, learn from us to improve the land they have left. And this development advice will, quote, yield them more benefit than all that land which we have of them. So this is one of the first appearances of what would turn out to be an extremely influential idea during the process of the West conquest of the West, which we could call the development right of conquest. Some Western actors could claim that they could develop the land better than the current inhabitants, then they had a right to take the land. That's the idea of the development right of conquest. And even more, if they felt they could develop the people who are on the land better than the people themselves had been able to do so far, that also gave them a right to conquer the people. In the name, with the rationale that John Winthrop just articulated, that they would bring the people development, and that would be an improvement in well-being. So what's interesting here is John Winthrop and his many successors did feel a need for some kind of moral justification of this conquest, moral justification of taking the land of others. And that kind of started what would really turn out to be not an empirical debate, but really a moral debate. So empirically, we could ask, was John Winthrop right that this process of conquest would raise material GDP a lot? And yes, on that he was very correct. This is a very well-known graph that Deirdre, among many others, have celebrated, that there's been a huge increase in per capita income over those centuries since John Winthrop arrived. This graph is logarithmic, meaning every increase in the unit doubles per capita income, so per capita income double over and over again. And so obviously, there was a huge increase in per capita GDP on that land that the Europeans settled on. So that seems to justify John Winthrop's claim that there would be a rapid development. Adam Smith noted that rapid development in The Wealth of Nations and suggested that the conditions in which kind of lightly settled land the inhabitants gave way to European settlers was very propitious conditions for rapid growth. And yet, Adam Smith seemed also to see this, like John Winthrop did, as not an empirical debate, but a moral debate. So if it was only an empirical debate, we could note, we certainly don't have any data. I mean, even this data is totally made up from nothing, I have to admit. But, we certainly don't have even data made up from nothing on Native Americans. We do know that Native Americans today are considerably poorer than the rest of the population of the United States, but still are at a level that must be way above what the level was in the 1600s. I mean, if we just, as a thought experiment, assume pretty reasonably that Native American income was not higher than this number in the 1600s, that would allow us to conclude that Native American income increased something like 40-fold from the time of the first conquest to today. So that seems also to justify John Winthrop's prediction that it would increase a lot the material income of the Native Americans as well. And yet, again, as I said, Adam Smith saw this not only as an empirical debate as what would raise GDP, but also as a moral debate. So despite his celebration of the material achievements of the British colonies, later the United States, he also had a statement in The Wealth of Nations. It's not very well known. He said, quote, "The savage injustice of the Europeans in conquest and settlement had been ruinous and destructive, to several of these unfortunate countries. So the savage injustice of the Europeans, that's what he wound up at. And so this is sort of point number one today. I'm going to have three main points. Point number one is Adam Smith sort of started the tradition of the classical liberal skepticism about whether some leader or government that has absolute power can really be trusted to be benevolent to its subjects. And Adam Smith said, no, you can't be trusted when you have absolute power, even if you claim to be acting in the interest of someone else. You know, the liberals were very skeptical about whether we could really take you seriously. In fact, Adam Smith had a very not well-known tendency to be sarcastic whenever this issue came up. He said sarcastically that the conquerors had, quote, the pious purpose of converting them to Christianity. It's also part of the package here, Christianity plus material GDP. But when there's no constraints on the violence that the Europeans could bring against the people they're trying to benefit, they simply pursue their own self-interest by what Adam Smith called, quote, plundering of the defenseless natives. So he's engaging John Winthrop and other like-minded rationales in the moral debate that John Winthrop seems to want, saying your moral justification is specious because we can't trust you to act in the interest of someone else. You're obviously acting in your own self-interest. And in fact, Winthrop very quickly got into a war with the local Pequot Indians, and they were mostly eliminated as a result of this war. There was a big massacre, and then they were distributed among other Indian nations, and some of them were sold into slavery in the Caribbean. Some of them were put as servants among the European settlers. And there was apparently no process by which the Pequots were asked whether they were willing to be massacred for the sake of other Native Americans 4 centuries later. So this is, a way in which it's sort of not very well-known angle in the history of liberal economics really gives us some insight into where liberal economics came from. In a way that's not really very appreciated at all. It came from partly this commentary on some of these extreme claims for benevolence in not very sensible circumstances. Another even more important idea in this debate between liberal economists and the development right of conquest was a really extreme idea, the idea of benevolent slavery. Slave owners and their intellectual allies argued repeatedly for 150 years that they were in fact bringing material benefits to the slaves. They claimed that the slaves had a higher material income than some comparison groups that were not in slavery, such as those people still in Africa, maybe the white working class at the time in the US or Britain. And what's interesting about this is Adam Smith actually agreed that that was probably true. Yeah. And other sort of non-slave owning interests have suggested this could have been true. The historian Robert Fogel thought it could have been true. Later, Amartya Sen discussed this issue, thought it could have been true. Other commentators at the time that were not self-interested slave owners thought this could have been true. But again, the liberals chose not to engage on whether that was true or false. They didn't see that as necessarily central to the question. They engaged in another, and this is point number 2 now, if you're keeping a scorecard. Point number 2, they had another classic liberal doubt about this, which is simply saying, wow, if people benefit so much from what you offer, why do you have to use so much force to get them to take it? And liberals for 200 years, from Adam Smith to Amartya Sen, they saw the real evaluation of the benevolent slavery idea as, quote, with Amartya Sen, and yet slaves did run away. They seemed to run away from all that benevolence that you were offering them. So their evaluation of progress with this benevolent slavery idea was not based on some material indicator like GDP per capita of slaves and non-slaves. it was based on the choices of those who were in slavery. If they showed by their behavior that they completely rejected the offer of benevolent slavery, or running away, doing everything possible to escape it, that is enough to tell you that it was not progress for them. So this is an extremely simple and obvious idea, and yet a very radical idea in the history of intellectual ideas. The progress would be defined not by some objective indicator, like material GDP, but progress would be defined by the choices of those who are the supposed beneficiaries of progress. They should be given the right to consent to their own progress, or to reject your plan for their progress. And so this redefinition of progress, beginning with Adam Smith and continuing with Harriet Martineau and John Stuart Mill, and continuing in the 20th century with other thinkers who discussed this benevolent slavery idea, is based entirely on the choices and the consent. For that matter, we could also use the choices of slave owners. Abraham Lincoln actually asked this sarcastically. He said, benevolent slavery is the only example of an idea that no one wants for themselves. They always want it for other people. And so he sort of sarcastically asked the slave owners, if slavery is so great, why don't you want it for yourself? So now, let's be super clear about this. This is not a scientific debate, which makes all of us as economic scientists a little uncomfortable. So we're sort of all squirming now that we have to engage in this stupid moral debate that we're not good at. And yet that's what the liberals insisted on, that positive science, positive economics and science were not enough to decide the well-being, whether well-being improves or deteriorates. That we need something else. And the something else that the liberals suggested was the principle of freedom, choice, consent. We could also call it agency. It's kind of unfortunately, kind of jargony word, but it is actually pretty precise. That agency, this means you're in charge of your own life. You're in charge of the things that affect you. You have a right to accept or reject what others want to do to you. And another classical liberal thinker that's not very well appreciated on this question was himself an ex-slave, Frederick Douglass. He also insisted material aid was not that relevant for deciding on whether slavery was benevolent or not. He said, quote, care for the slave is no compensation for slavery. You could surround the slave with luxuries, but these would only enhance his torment that he was a slave. After the Civil War, Frederick Douglass was also not super happy with the patronizing interventions of white men from the North. He insisted philanthropic efforts must have, quote, the consent of those in whose interests they have been professedly created. Let me say that again. Philanthropic efforts, said Frederick Douglass, must have, quote, the consent of those in whose interest they have been professedly created. So the classical liberals are saying not only they're proposing a normative principle of consent, they're also seeing human beings as themselves having a demand for the right to consent, a demand for agency. The human beings, in their view of human nature, did not only demand material income, material consumption, but also demanded agency, also wanted freedom not only as a means to an end of higher material income, but as a good in itself, that they wanted to have agency over their own lives. Then point number 3 now, of course, how do you exactly achieve this consent? You know, lots of people have to consent here. How exactly are you going to achieve some process by which everyone has a right to consent? That sounds really complex and complicated that you would find some way to make that happen. Well, Adam Smith had an idea. He had an idea called trade, commerce, markets, whatever word we use. That markets, trade whether domestic or international, was a way in which two parties could mutually consent to interact with each other. And agreeing to that exchange would show that by their choices, by the same criteria of the progress criteria based on consent, they would show by their choices in the exchange that they both perceive themselves as better off. So this was a way to achieve, this is, now we're getting into Econ 101 that is super obvious. I don't want to insult your intelligence by giving you such obvious 101 principles. But I want to emphasize how this appeared, these 101 principles appeared in this context of this debate. So Frederick Douglass would have liked a free market and labor instead of slavery. Super obvious, but now we're starting seeing where these ideas sort of launched from. And so the ability of commerce to solve this problem, it doesn't create a utopia. It leaves other problems unsolved. We also have problems with how the state is going to create the environment for trade, or how an international order is going to create the environment for trade. These were not resolved by these classical liberals at the time. And it's kind of characteristic of classical liberals. They're much better at saying what should not happen than what should happen. So markets were a partial answer to what should happen, but did not automatically create some overnight utopia without other things that were necessary. But still, this is a powerful insight. And so Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations said, he lamented, he said, quote, "There could have been a new set of exchanges which shouldn't," he's talking about now the conquest of the Americas, as compared to what did happen, there could have been a new, quote, "a new set of exchanges which should naturally have proved as advantageous to the new as it certainly did to the old continent." So he's saying, wow, there could have been trade instead of conquest. There could have been commerce instead of conquest. And both sides would have benefited from this trade. That was a peaceful, mutually beneficial, voluntary, consensual interaction that could have happened. And sadly, conquest happened instead of commerce. But then, if now you're feeling kind of gloomy about what's going on, Adam Smith also in The Wealth of Nations made a remarkable prophecy. Also does not get as much attention as it deserves. The prophecy was, quote, "The inhabitants of all the different quarters of the world may arrive at that equality where independent nations have some sort of respect for the rights of one another." And this is the other classical liberal idea, that you don't want just rights for yourself, but by process of non-hypocrisy and equality of status, you also support rights for everyone else. It's a lot easier to be enthusiastic about your own rights than the rights of other people. We have lots of schemes about violating the freedom of other people. To put it, a lot of government policies and development policies are based on violating the rights of other people for some goal that I have. And to paraphrase Margaret Thatcher, sooner or later you run out of other people's freedom. And so that's sort of the central classical liberal idea, that you have a sort of equality of status of everyone, that they all have the right to this mutually consensual process and not to be coerced. So this is super important point number 3, and sort of the climactic point is that commerce was the alternative instead of conquest, and that Adam Smith predicted commerce was going to displace conquest someday. And this he was right. Again, no utopia has arrived yet, but in fact it did happen that commerce did start to replace coercion, did start to replace conquest. So let me go through this somewhat complicated graph to show you what I have in mind. I only have an hour and a half left to go through the graph. That might be enough to explain all the lines. So the gray line is index of slaves shipped annually in the British slave trade. That was very high. Then the slave trade was abolished in 1808, and that form of coercion was eliminated. American slavery is the orange line, that slavery was exploding in the pre-Civil War era, and then was abruptly terminated with emancipation and the amendment that ended slavery. The black line is with each successive colony, how much of the indigenous inhabitants were killed, died, or removed in the first century after contact. That was high in the first wave of colonization, but fell a lot in later waves of colonization. So that may have been just because of practicality, but it may be the liberals who opposed Indian removal and other policies against the Indians may have had a little bit of influence. Colonialism, of course, is the blue line, share of countries in the world colonized. That shot way up and then abruptly came down with the end of colonialism in the 1950s and 1960s. Of course, that also did not automatically result in, wonderful liberal governments in the post-colonial states. There are a lot of dictators, but at least one form of coercion, the coercion of outside European powers to coerce you to do something you don't want to do. At least that form of coercion was eliminated. And then the green line is another form of violent saviors. The communists, after Lenin and Stalin, engaged in massive coercion and did succeed in raising a lot Soviet GDP and GDP of the Eastern European states. But the populations in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union were not so happy about that, and they succeeded in achieving the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Soviet Union. And so that form of coercion also went way down. And then replacing all of this is the skyrocketing trade with Asia and Africa, between the West and Asia and Africa. The orange line is the explosion of trade that happened in the late 20th century and into the 21st century. Now, I've heard that there might be some problems with free trade today. I don't know anything about that, but so far that has not erased this massive explosion of trade that has happened, the way in which commerce has replaced conquest. So that's the good news. Now let me close with saying, well, how does that affect the world of economic development today? The foreign aid agencies and development economists like myself and many others who work on trying to end material poverty in the developing world. So the most obvious thing to say is, well, at least they're not doing benevolent slavery. So there has been, this progress has made it possible, including the recognition of the importance of trade in many development circles, has made it possible for development to be a lot more benevolent today than it used to be. And yet, we still have that problem that I raised at the beginning. We still seem to believe, at least tepidly or enthusiastically, in the idea of benevolent autocrats that the only way we know they're benevolent is they raised material GDP, and maybe now we think material GDP is not totally reliable as an indicator of well-being. Maybe we've learned that from the classical liberal history that I've gone through with colonialism. So a lot of development economists, of the great development economists in the liberal tradition, have noted that commerce was a great way to replace coercion in development. Again, let me cite P.T. Bauer and Milton Friedman, and a somewhat more complicated case of Amartya Sen, who wrote the book Development as Freedom. And Amartya Sen has somewhat awkward wording, but he did note that he criticized the way in which economics had tended to move away from focusing on this is a quote, economics tended to move away from focusing on the value of freedom to that of material incomes. And he lamented that. And he sort of unsuccessfully tried to argue for using freedom as a direct measure of well-being, as an end in itself, and not just as a means to higher material income. Which he said, this movement away from freedom to material income, he said it did lead to an underappreciation of the full role of the market mechanism. I mean, Amartya Sen is not the most elegant writer. I have not seen any refrigerator magnets that say, don't have an underappreciation of the full role of the market mechanism. But the point is pretty clear, that we celebrate markets not just for the way they achieve material income, but the way they make it possible to achieve human freedom, or as Abraham Lincoln said with the end of slavery and the rise of freedom, freedom is indeed the last best hope of mankind.
That's a great job.
We will hear from my colleague, Deirdre McCloskey. Deirdre really is one of the country's most important economic historians, one of the world's most important economic historians. And I can think of nobody better to comment on this book than her, because one of the themes that she has developed over many decades in many books and much of her writing and thinking is about the role of ethics in development and the role that ethics played in making the world rich. And so I look forward to what she will have to say. She's a distinguished scholar and Isaiah Berlin Chair in Liberal Thought here at the Cato Institute. She's also a distinguished Professor Emerita of Economics and of History and a Professor Emerita of English and of Communication at the University of Illinois at Chicago. She has taught at the University of Chicago and the University of Iowa. She has written some 25 books, hundreds, more than 400 academic articles, some of them popular articles. She has too many books to mention. One series of her books, the Bourgeois Trilogy, is very well known and influential. And I'll just mention one more book, only because I like the title so much. Leave Me Alone and I'll Make You Rich. Welcome.
Thank you very much. You know, of the social thinkers, I guess I would put myself in, who stutter, I'm the 10th. And I always stutter on my favorite word, which is liberalism. Now you can draw some Freudian conclusions from that if you want. But I always learn from Bill, from his book and from his talk. I wish we had been colleagues all these years, because we have a lot in common and a lot of minor disagreements, but mainly we have a lot in common in this matter of bringing ethics back into economics. Now, as Bill points out very persuasively in his wonderful book, Adam Smith, now I always cross myself when I mention Adam Smith, started off economics, or his inquiries, from an ethical point of view. His first book, which Bill quotes extensively, was not The Wealth of Nations, good as it was, but was The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which is just, they're both terrific books, which I urge you to read, and put them by your bed and read a chapter every night. And that's what was odd, as Bill points out, about the subsequent history of economics, that there's this big period, which in some minds is still going on, where we're not supposed to discuss ethics, or, well, the Indians are so much better off, both kinds of Indians, because, come on, don't be so sentimental talking about whether they volunteered for colonization or extermination. And I think it's terribly important that we get back to being serious about ethics in economics, for economic development, for a moral economic development. And I'd like to ask you, Bill, one more point in preparation of what I want to ask you. Seems to me that a smart way of thinking about liberty versus coercion is precisely to think about increasing coercion and whether it's a good idea or a bad idea. Now, some coercion is necessary. If your 3-year-old boy proposes to walk out into the traffic, you don't initiate a liberal discussion of whether it would be good to get killed. You grab him. We need a police force, we need a government. We at Cato, and I certainly am not an anarchist. But the question of the hour, which Bill's book beautifully illustrates, is whether we've reached, as we economists say, diminishing returns in coercion. Now, there are lots of economists, including, I would say, Amartya Sen, alas, who think, well, no, there's here, I got a few more proposals for coercing people that will be good for them. Darren Acemoglu, for example, and many other liberal, in some sense, economists want us to make the state bigger and coerce us more. So I ask you, Bill, this point you make about, as it were, foreign coercion, how much can you make the same kind of story about domestic coercion, about the rise of the modern state? You know, once it was standard 100 years ago and longer for all the expenditure of the local, state, and federal governments in free countries was about 10%. Now in France, it's 55%. In Sweden, before its crash in the 1990s, it was 73%. And it's quite high, even in the United States and in Japan, which are among the lowest. So how about it?
Mm-hmm. Should I answer now?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I mean, that is a great point. And as you said, some coercion isn't necessary, so we don't want to go to a place where any coercion is just as bad as extreme coercion. You know, parking tickets are not like Nazism.
No.
So the question is where to draw the line and who decides that. And you know, certainly I think as much as you, are very concerned about the ability of the state to coerce domestic individuals also. And the same argument about having constraints on the power of the state is relevant as was having constraints on the power of colonizers or conquerors, even if it's in a less extreme form than it was then. But then the really difficult question is how do you achieve those constraints on the state? And I would argue that you also want to go to some kind of non-coercive process to achieve that. Mm-hmm. I mean, one of the reasons people like benevolent autocrats in development is the sort of pro-market, market-friendly benevolent autocrats seem to offer a shortcut that is using coercion to kind of impose the conditions for free markets and trade domestically. And they're doing that through their own coercion as benevolent autocrats. And we've all sort of had the temptation to say, oh, those guys are okay. They're imposing free markets. That's creating a lot of freedom rather than taking away freedom. That's okay. But there's a couple of problems with that. One is just how much it discredits free markets by associating it with unpopular, coercive, autocratic bad guys. And second, when you oppose coercion, I think you also might want to go to some sort of reliance on processes of persuasion and discussion in a democratic context to try to persuade the democratic voters that these constraints on the power of the rulers and the creation of conditions for free markets are desirable.
Yeah.
But I don't think coercion to make possible free markets is ever kind of to me, it's not ever kind of a helpful shortcut. You still need to go to the messy, long-run process of trying to persuade.
That's
Even
so
when
true.
even when you're totally unsuccessful, as economists usually are, at persuading the voters of that.
I think that's very true. I'm a student of the rhetorical tradition since the
I
ancient
thought you would
Greeks.
like that.
And sweet talk, persuasion, is the core liberal idea. And by the way, notice that Bill uses the L word, I'll say that so I won't stutter, in the classical sense. And I think it's really important that we get back to that. For example, there is a widespread conviction among certain philosophers, one of whom is a colleague of yours at NYU, that persuasion is coercion. Now, wait a second. If sweet talk is coercion, then everything's coercion. And we're in a court of sort of Calvinist predestination, I don't know, inevitability. There's nothing to be done about anything. No, I think persuasion is the way to go. I have a friend in Romania who says, who speaks of inner revolutions and outer revolutions. And outer revolutions are the imposition of, well, I tell you, dear, this is going to be good for you. Whereas he says, no, the only revolutions that partake of this persuasive, voluntary character are inner revolutions. And I'm friendly with Chileans, and at the University of Chicago, I educated more Chicago boys than Milton Friedman did, who went to Chile and implemented liberalism by force. And that's the tragedy of Chile. It's worked out pretty well, and they're doing quite well, but it's too bad that they didn't do it the persuasive way.
I have a question for you. I'll take issue with what you just said, but
Well,
first,
I thought you might.
to some extent, because the way they did it was to increase the options available for people.
Yeah, that's true.
They increased free trade. They increased market options. They
Well, and
increased
then-
things. And the guys who did it were very conscious that if you increase those freedoms, you will make people more independent of the state, and it will lead, as it did, toward more full-fledged freedoms, including
It did.
political freedoms and so on. They were very, not Pinochet, the guys who were behind the revolution were very conscious of that.
Yeah.
And, they had the American model in mind. But that seems to be another discussion. Why do you think, Bill, that economists are so uncomfortable talking about ethics, talking about the topic of your book? Do you think that there is such a thing as value-free economics? You have a great chapter in your book where you talk about, for example, the history of the American Economics Association.
Yeah.
Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, so in Alfred Marshall and some of the in Britain and some of the early founders of the AA came along, they said, oh, we want to make this a science. We're going to take away, this silly preference for consent of John Stuart Mill and Adam Smith and Harriet Martineau and all those others. And we're going to emphasize precisely, material outcomes in a scientific way, what helps improve material outcomes. And they were also super concerned about inequality. It seemed to be in the late 19th century that capitalism was generating a lot of inequality in the US and Britain. And so, they said, okay, now we're just taking away the amateur ethics that some economists try to do. It usually just shows they're bad economists. We're going back to economics as a science based on what raises material income and improves inequality, which is super important to them. Of course, they were just concealing their own values in disguise. They valued inequality, reducing inequality more than valuing freedom. And they're willing to violate freedom to achieve their desired goal of inequality. So that's the way in which value three economics is a myth. Everyone participating in the debate has their values on what their goals are. And part of the disagreement is not scientific. It's a disagreement over what the goals should be, which are decided on sort of ethical grounds. And of course, that is pointing that out is super unpopular because it leads to a very inconvenient, sidetracking of the scientific debate into things that we're all not very good at. And also they're not very persuasive because I can't say, I like consent and I'm morally superior to all you guys, so you should just, adopt my morally righteous preference for consent. That's not a persuasive way to go, and I think that's why we tend to shy away from going that way. But I think pointing out that everyone has their own values that inform economic analysis, I think that is a fruitful line of discussion. And so we can't impose how much someone else cares about freedom versus inequality, but we can point out that there is differing values on that, and then the values have to also be discussed.
Yeah, but I would quarrel not with your position, but the long-standing peculiarity of English about the word science. In English before the middle of the 19th century, and in every other language I've looked into, say German, the science word is Wissenschaft. And it means systematic inquiry. And there can be systematic inquiry into ethics. There can be systematic inquiry into English poetry. Systematic inquiry is not confined to the physical and biological sciences. Yet that's how it's used in our culture these days, often aggressively. They'd say that people like the three of us, you say you're social scientists. I'm a physicist. I'm a real scientist. That's a lot of crap. And so learning systematically about these other human sciences, sciences humaines, the French say, is very sensible for a person who wants to do ethical work in development, it seems to me. Mm-hmm. I mean, to praise Amartya Sen instead of attacking him, as I usually do, he's one of the few people who brought serious ethical thinking back to economics. This is back in the 1980s.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We have time for questions from the audience. If you have a question, raise your hand and wait for the microphone to arrive and identify yourself and your affiliation. We can start in the corner there with the gentleman raising his hand, and then we'll come over to this side after.
Thank you. My name is Roger Cochetti. I am a retired high technology industry executive and author of a couple of books on the history of satellite communications and an occasional commentator. And the question I have is one that has a forward-looking aspect to it, and that is it not the case in the nature of humans that we prefer the devil we don't know to the devil that we do know? So that I would I would suspect that a large number of the slaves held in the Inca, Aztec, and Mayan civilizations, where if you could conduct a democratic secret ballot with them, would you prefer these conquistadors to rule you or your current masters? Or if you ask the same question of African slaves of nearby tribes or of Arabs, or if you, bringing it to more modern times, if you ask many Jews in Germany, would you prefer to be ruled by Joseph Stalin, as bad as he is? And the reason I ask the question is because I think we may be facing a question in the not that distant future when the issue is, would you prefer to be ruled by an artificial intelligence which views humans as just humans, as I don't care what color you are, what gender you are, just you're a human, and should we not give more? In other words, the devil that you don't know can always look more attractive than the devil that you do know. And thus, if that's the case, many of the enslaved people you're describing may have, if you could actually ask them, you know, would you prefer your slavery now or this new slavery, might have said, I'll take this conquistador. So my question has a forward aspect to it, which would be, I'd love to hear any comments you might have on that too. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, implicit in your question is already a liberal value that somebody should ask them.
Yeah.
And the fact that they were not asked is really the heart of the critique. How they might answer if they were asked is another complication that you're very insightful about. But actually, one of the big tests of the idea you have in mind was actually the end of colonialism, in which it seemed very clear that anti-colonialism was such a powerful movement because local people did actually prefer native autocrats to European autocrats in the form of colonial rule. And why was that? And I quote some thinkers on that question in the book. Well, I think it was primarily because being told, you know, I'm a member of a group that is inherently unfit for self-government, and I need this other group that is biologically superior to me to be my rulers, that, not surprisingly, is a super unpopular idea, with members of every group being told that. And so, you know, that was why colonialism was sort of an anti-liberal disaster on the equality of status issue also. And that's partly why, unfortunately, because liberals were not kind of prominent enough in those voices worldwide, why, in a way, the left captured, the socialists captured the anti-colonial movement, which is kind of a lasting tragedy. And so, you know, I think being very consistent about the equality of status between all peoples is kind of the crucial thing that we need there to understand why colonialism was extremely unpopular and why, despite all the post-colonial disasters, there's been almost no support for any movement back to colonialism.
Let's take a question from Jack Goldstone there, please.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you, everyone, for this. Bill, I've been a fan since the elusive quest for growth. I'm Jack Goldstone, sociologist, part-time economic historian at George Mason University. I want to push back a little on your graph about conquest, imperialism, one of those lines fell, and commerce with Asia and Africa exploded. Good thing. My concern, though, is that conceals that contracts are in some way a modern form of conquest. Chevron Oil sweet talks the head of Nigeria into a mutually satisfactory deal. Chevron gets the oil and the profits involved. The head of Nigeria gets money to buy homes in London and Geneva. And the people in northern Nigeria get preyed on by Islamic terrorists, and the ones in southern Nigeria get their water polluted by petrochemicals. So these modern contracts, in a sense, are another form of conquest with many of the same negative side effects. I know you know this well and have thought about it, but what do you suggest as a way to take the liberal approach to this situation?
Great question. You know, I think now we have to kind of try to define what is commerce, what is free trade. And it seemed clear from this discussion, and this was very clear in all the classical liberals, beginning with Adam Smith, that you do need to include in the definition of trade some kind of constraint on any party to the trade having the ability to coerce the other party. That needs to be included in the very definition of what is free trade. And so the example you're giving, I think, is where sort of a complicated case, but there is a lot of coercion involved, that the Exxon is going to be able to appeal to the coercion of the Nigerian state to do bad things to the local population in ways that are not involved in voluntary transactions. When Thomas Clarkson was instrumental in the abolition of the British slave trade, he had this phrase that finally we have achieved some moral boundaries to our commerce. So commerce needs those moral boundaries in favor of non-coercion.
Do you have a question?
Thank you. Hello, my name is Austin O'Connell. I'm a third-year economics student at George Washington University. Classical liberalism claims to be a universalistic philosophy that any one part of the world can arrive at through proper use of the reason. But why is it that there's so few cases of non-Western societies adopting classical liberal institutions without some sort of coercion or threat of coercion from the West? Is there something unique about Western societies that makes them especially conducive to the ideals of individual liberty, free markets, and limited government? Thank you.
Great, another great question, Austin. I guess the question is, it is a troubling question what you asked. Why has liberalism not been very successful in the non-Western world? I mean, there are some successes that are heartening, kind of the rise of more liberal democracy in places like South Korea, Japan, some more ambiguous kind of democracy cases like Botswana in Africa. Obviously in Latin America, there's been a lot more, at least some regimes have been very much more liberal regimes. I would also argue that it's useful to kind of think about other choices that are going on that people make about liberalism. Why do so many students from the rest of the world want to study in the US and Britain and get a liberal education? That's kind of revealing also about some kind of preferences for liberalism. But, why do people even want to travel so much or immigrate from non-liberal societies to liberal ones? That's also revealing in some way. But I agree with you, it is troubling, and I'm not sure I know the answer why liberalism has not been more successful. I could kind of hint a little bit, something I said in the book, that the fact that liberalism was not very successful capturing the anti-colonial issue, the anti-racist, anti-colonial issue, maybe has something to do with that, and the way it was captured by Lenin and Stalin, and a lot of the post-colonial parties were Marxist. So I think that has something to do with it, but it is troubling, I agree with you.
Deirdre, did you want to say anything about that?
Well, to agree and to say that, I'm an ethical realist, which is a term in philosophy. And I believe there are real ethical facts. And whether or not they're able to achieve it, I think humans flourish with liberty. That's a fact.
I think that we can show that with the empirical evidence. I also think that you can go anywhere in the developing world and find enormous informal economies and enormous informal markets, which are none other than the mass embrace of free, unregulated markets.
That's right.
Or liberalism in its economic expression. And so I don't think, actually, that liberalism is that far away from most people. It's fairly common sense. People know what's theirs and what's others, property rights. It's due to a lot of accidents of history and things that Deirdre has written tons of books about, that liberalism emerged in one place rather than another. And certainly how you think about those things, the ethics has a lot to do with it. So I don't think that the rest of the world is so far away from this. It's just that it has had greater challenges to make it happen, but it is happening, and that I think we can say confidently. Okay, we'll take, this gentleman in the front has had his hand up for a long time, so we'll take a question from him.
Thank you. My name is Daniel Stakov. I work as advisor at International Monetary Fund. And before that, I have translated your book, Bill, previous book, Tyranny of Experts, into Russian language. So my question is this. In previous book, in Tyranny of Experts, you have written a lot about experts, how they're misguided, how their ideas proved like created so much adverse impact for the poor. In this book, in The Violent Saviors, a lot of discussion about politicians, about rulers. And when experts appear, some of them even do good things and promote good ideas. So I guess my question is, have your thinking about the relationship between experts and people in power evolved during this time, or like how, in what way do you see this relationship now?
Yeah, I mean, this is a beautiful question because you could say, well, Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill and P.T. Bauer and Milton Friedman, these are all experts that were offering very good things that were very positive. The paradox is their good things were sort of based on being anti-expert, having constraints on the power of socialist experts and technocratic experts in development to do technocratic anti-freedom things, which is what I was previously upset about in the previous book. And so the anti-expert is kind of the paradox, but I think is a powerful force in intellectual history. But in a way that's not very attractive to the experts. For Adam Smith to say, just shut up and leave people alone is not addressing the experts, is not proven to be a very popular idea among experts.
The three of us are experts, by the way.
Well, at least two of us. How about Mustafa Akyol right there in the center?
Thank you so much, Mustafa Akyol from Cato here. I work on ideas of liberalism in the Islamic world, which is not too easy, as you can imagine. But and there are internal challenges sometimes, like religious illiberalism, fundamentalism, as the West itself had too for many centuries. But also one problem I always see is liberalism is associated Western colonialism and imperialism, precisely the problem you're talking about. And actually, the worse that gets, the worse the anti-liberal reaction gets. I mean, it becomes hard to speak of freedom in the Muslim world when Operation Freedom drops bombs on people, and to say that, this is a great thing you should ask for. So, and that's why in my writings I try to distinguish between liberalism and imperialism, as socialists had their imperialism, fascists their imperialism, Islam had its own imperialism. So thank you for writing this book, which is, I think, very important for my own work. Are there also strong liberal traditions? I know Adam Smith wrote about that. One reason Deirdre always hails Adam Smith, and one of the many reasons, he was against imperialism. Are there also liberal intellectual pioneers which we can say, look, they were defending liberalism on a principled basis, not as a part of Western colonial adventure, to help my case to advocate for liberalism in Islamic societies? Thank you.
Yeah, great. I certainly agree with you. And yes, there were some discussions of this issue. John Quincy Adams, a president of the United States and son of another president, has this quote that was quoted by Chris Coyne at George Mason in his book In Search of Monsters to Destroy, that he said he announced a policy of the U.S. of non-intervention, saying the U.S. does not go in search of monsters to destroy. Where people fight for freedom, we sympathize with their fight, but we don't intervene. And that sort of non-intervention policy is, I think, a liberal tradition, but one that's not very well known. I mean, there is the Quincy Institute here in Washington that's named after John Quincy Adams. But that cause has been tarnished with this awful word isolationism, which is, it's not non-intervention is not isolationism. It's saying intervention is itself a form of coercion that does not usually lead to good things and is not normatively defensible. And we have, the history littered with disasters like Afghanistan and Libya and all the other examples of intervention. So yeah, I think there is liberal support, but it's a lot fainter than I would like it to be for your cause.
Okay, we have a question in the back. This gentleman in the back. Yep, that's right.
So many of the key issues in development arise over infrastructure, and my impression after many years of involvement is that without some element of coercion, infrastructure does not get built. There is a reason that there's eminent domain in the Constitution. So today in development, the biggest development assistance program recently has been the Chinese Belt and Road, which has done some good things and has also loaded down the recipient nations with a great deal of debt. How do you apply these ideas you've been talking about to the questions of infrastructure?
Mm-hmm. Great thing to discuss, which I didn't discuss, but it's another example of this complicated question. Eminent domain is coercion, and it seems necessary that if nobody ever sold their property for infrastructure, that would lead to some pretty bad outcomes. I think it's another example where acknowledging the need for some coercion, you also need the ability to have some restraints on that degree of coercion, which does not exist in the Chinese Belt and Road initiative that you're talking about. There's no restraint. There's not enough restraint, so it could do actually very harmful things. But like in a more mild case where you just want some eminent domain to make possible an infrastructure project, I think, again, you have the paradox that a democratic system will vote for some coercion, but also some limits on that coercion, so we'll sort of decide what is the acceptable amount of coercion. And again, there's no way to sort of short-circuit that and have some experts say what is the right amount. It needs to be some democratic process of discussion where you have some eminent domain, but not too much. And I don't know enough about that to give you anything further that's useful, but I think it's a classic example of deciding coercion.
Well, I am just completing a book on open fields and enclosures, an obscure economic history topic. And enclosures in the 18th century in England were an example of eminent domain. And the question is, were they fair or not? That's one of the outstanding issues. I always get a little nervous when I hear the word infrastructure because it's used to justify high-handed state action all over the world. By the way, I have some advice for the countries burdened with debt to the Chinese because the Chinese built a railway in their country. Don't pay it. It's actually pretty simple.
Okay. Question in the back. Yep. Ryan.
Thank you very much, Ryan Bourne, Cato Institute. As you can probably tell from my voice, I'm British, so this question will be a bit self-serving. But I can understand the argument that it's deeply unethical and immoral on a contemporaneous basis to have argued that a lot of the colonial activities undertaken by my country, other people's countries, were fine because they were good or raising the material progress of people who live there. But I want to ask you about your why you decided to write this book now, because as you probably know, most of the debates that are going on about the legacy of colonialism in terms of its effects on countries today, not contemporaneously. And at what stage do you kind of say, okay, I can imagine that colonialism, imperialism casts a long shadow, but there's been sovereignty, self-determination in many of these countries now for 50 to 100 years, and yet many outcomes still appear to be poor, and there's deep illiberalism in many countries. At what stage do we move on from talking about the legacy of colonialism and say, actually, a lot of the problems that remain are self-induced?
Good one. Good one, Ryan. So, you know, I think we need to be clear about what the classical liberals are doing in this debate. It's not, so you're right. You can't just like have open season for blaming colonialism for everything, as post-colonial governments were often prone to do, and kind of excusing their own failures and their own tyrannies by doing that. And I don't really talk about that question at all. How much does colonialism explain the bad outcomes today? Because remember, the examples that are most interesting are ways in which colonialism did actually improve material incomes, and yet still was misguided on these other grounds that we've talked about. So, but I agree with you. This debate should not just be, you know, a recipe for doing the kind of thing that you do, which kind of destroys the intelligent dialogue about today's policies. You can't just there's no reason to just blame colonialism on everything. I mean, blame everything on colonialism, sorry.
Isn't your message about the importance of people's freedoms with the West's interaction with the rest really also apply universally? Are you getting the answer?
Yeah, I have a friend who's helping me text in the intelligent answers. Nothing I've said was my own comment.
So doesn't your critique apply to all rulers?
Yeah, I mean, any autocracy you could think of as, in a way, it's a kind of new colonialism that sort of your own subjects and the members of your own nation are your subjects, and now you are the colonial power, claiming to apply coercion for their own good because they don't know what's best for them. And that's a colonial mindset also, and the fight for freedom is fighting against that mindset.
Yeah, it's our earlier point that it's not just country to country, it's inside each country.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. Did you have a question? You've been very patient.
Thank you. Chris Purdy with DKT International. We're a global social business that markets and sells contraceptives all over the world. So just to take the questions in a slightly different direction, sort of thinking about modern saviors and international development, and the landscape has changed so much, especially in the last year. The dissolution of USAID and groups like the Gates Foundation, the Buffett Foundation have said they're going to close their doors in the next 10 to 20 years. ODA in Europe is greatly diminished. And obviously a topic that you've written about before. Do you see these changes in philanthropy also as an opportunity to kind of rethink how we engage with markets to change the world and to make the world a better place? And how do you look at particularly these drastic drops in international aid? I mean, there's good and there's bad that's going to come out of it, but I'd really be interested to hear your perspective. Thank you.
I wasn't a super big fan of the way in which you just sent a big wrecking ball through USAID, and indiscriminate wrecking ball in a way that, violated sort of the gradualism that liberals usually prefer, abrogated existing contracts, and, swept away stuff that was actually working a little bit along with stuff that was destructive. I think it would have been better to just allow to happen what was already happening. And that is something at the end of the book, I have some graphs on, that aid was already becoming a lot less important because of the surge in private market interaction. So you could say, just take the sum of foreign direct investment, remittances by immigrants, and exports from a poor country, from any region in Africa that's 10 times larger than aid. In the rest of the developing world, it's like 40 times larger than aid. So aid was also already becoming progressively unimportant. I think it would have been better to continue with that as a very gradual process in which we were growing away from aid and into commerce.
The gentleman on the side there.
Thank you very much for your book. I'm 85 years old and I experienced British colonialism and Portuguese and French. I was a guerrilla fighter in Africa. We are not concerned anymore with the problem of colonialism and imperialism in Africa. We are now in the threshold of setting up Songhai Federation, United States of Africa, as to resolve our problem for development and et cetera, et cetera. It would have happened 2017. It didn't happen because they killed Gaddafi. I was the one or two people who recruited Gaddafi to our project. I'm now in charge. 2027, the 54 heads of government in Africa will proclaim Songhai Federation following the referendum on that day, September 21, 2027, which the voters in Africa will vote yes. And in the Constitution, economic competition, economic freedom is an entrenched article on it. So it's part of liberalism.
Very good to know.
Great, very good to know. I don't know much about that, so I'd love to talk to you more about that. It is true that another one of the kind of bad legacies of colonialism was the way that it left behind kind of very small states with very hardened borders in Africa that severely interfered with the process of trade within Africa. So the process you're talking about might seem to be very promising from that standpoint.
We'll take a question from this gentleman, please. Yeah.
Oh, hi. Thank you. Carl Pulzer, Inequality, Inc. So, first of all, I think you have a powerful thesis. And I'm superimposing it in my own mind on what the U.S. is paying Israel or the Zionist government to do vis-a-vis the land in Palestine that's occupied by a population that's defined as a lesser and less powerful than human. But anyhow, my question has to do with intellectually. One thing where I wonder if we need to think about a little more. Freedom is a very important idea and a value, but to counteroppose that to markets, I don't know that it's kind of oil and vinegar. Markets are a tool, like a wedge. They can do good or evil. And markets were working well, to transmit slaves to the New World. It took a government, I think it was either Connecticut or Massachusetts in the 1780s, just before the Constitution was written, to ban that market. It's the first state to do that, and then, history went on. But I'm not sure that I think markets can be bad or good, or, in terms of value. I just wanted to throw that out there.
Thanks.
Yeah, I agree with you more than you might think. Capitalism in general, or markets in particular, are not, I think the argument of the left that they inherently are leading to slavery is wrong. I think the argument of the free market sympathizers that they automatically lead to consensual transactions is also wrong. You need to decide how markets are going to operate for markets to be beneficial. If markets are based on me plundering Ian and Deirdre and then going out and selling it to you, I can call that a market, but that obviously creates an opening for me to use coercion to impose negative sum losses on Deirdre and Ian. Maybe we don't want to call that a free market. We call it something else, markets with some parties engaged in massive violence, and that's not going to meet our definition of what's really a free market. So again, get back to the idea of Thomas Clarkson that the abolition of slavery created these moral boundaries on markets, and they need those moral boundaries to be beneficial.
Well, and I would only add that it's not obvious that the instrumentalities we have for changing markets are themselves ethically constrained. Because if you know, actually your example's a fine one. For centuries, governments enforced slavery, which was a post-violence free market.
That's right. I think that we up here could probably all agree on a definition of markets that was based on voluntary exchange and the respect for property rights. That's the way in which most liberals use the term free markets and economic freedom. We've long defined it that way. So when those principles are violated, we certainly don't consider that a part of capitalism. A part of capitalism that violates liberal principles of the kind that I think Bill is talking about in this book and in others. We have time for at least one more question. If anybody has a final question, we'll take it. Right here in the front row, or not the front row, the second row.
I wanted to get all three of you to comment on this.
Could you just identify yourself, please? Yeah.
I'm Ramachandran, formerly at one of the development institutions and a Chicago graduate as well. Milton Friedman gave a very nice explanation that satisfied a lot of people, that commerce and free markets would lead to liberties. And it is not always the case, I am now convinced. When we look back and see the development of China, markets have strengthened coercive governments, and not just in China, but in other countries as well, India, where I come from. And the question then becomes, what do we do about commerce if we fear that it's going to strengthen coercion in some places?
That's a good one, Ram. My friend Ram, who is supposed to ask, where can I buy the book? Instead, he asked this hard question. Well, let me try a lame attempt, and then I hope Ian and Deirdre will rescue me. So, you know, I think it's super important to say that it's not that freedom is self-enforcing. Freedom is not self-enforcing. So in that sense, having some commerce does not automatically lead to self-enforcing restraint from coercion by all the parties to that commerce. You need something else to come in to constrain the commerce to be benevolent by not engaging in all the parties not engaging in coercion. I mean, I think liberals hoped that they could make the case that commerce would causally lead to more freedom, or that even that slavery was bad for the slave owners because they would have been able to achieve more things if they had chosen a non-slave model. It's not at all clear that that's necessarily true. I think slave owners got very rich, probably richer than they would have without slavery. So it's not a self-enforcing process. You need something else, the process of moral persuasion that did come from the classical liberals throughout this period. And don't expect that's all going to automatically happen just because there's some commerce.
Well, I think that's absolutely crucial. I think that and although Milton Friedman was an ethical man and a colleague of mine and a friend, I think he was kind of separating economic liberty from other kinds. And I think liberty is liberty. I don't think the market is something separate from free, individual, uncoerced choice. But as Bill says, that's not gonna do much if it doesn't have a ethical basis. A long time ago, I wrote a book called The Bourgeois Virtues, which went into this in great detail and said, look, it's not obvious that the market corrupts ethics, but it is necessary for people to be people and to do what their mom said.
But would you restrict trade with banks?
With banks?
With people who are coercive?
Do you restrict trade with people who are coercive?
Well, no. The Chinese have slave labor. I wish we'd close it off, frankly.
I think it's safe to say that none of us are historical determinists. I think in general, the idea of authoritarian regimes opening up their economies has led to further liberalization, civil and political. There's no question that China, that the Chinese people, since the reforms began, are much, much freer, not just richer, much freer than they were before. And so, I mean, you're asking the right question, what's compared to what? The famous Chicago University question, not compared to an ideal, compared to the real life alternatives. And that would have been not doing it, not trading with them. We don't actually know what the result would be, but we know that they would be poorer and people would have less freedom within China. Another thing to say is that this movie isn't over with yet. We're all assuming that just because in the last 10 years China started to go in a more authoritarian direction, there was nothing predetermined about that, that that's going to continue and that China will be a governable country. And I think in some ways China is a puzzle because it is so large. It's different than other countries. And so it's not following an exact pattern. Life is messy. I wouldn't throw away the big idea just because of China, and certainly not at the expense of Chinese people's freedoms and the well-being of so much of the world that has increased largely because China is trading with them. I think we've run out of time. Thank you for everybody for joining us, and thank you, Deirdre, and especially thank you, Bill Easterly, for coming back to the Cato Institute one more time. Thank you.